and unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's nice to see so many people on a nice summer evening. And hi to the Zoomers, Scott and Robin and Bob, and I don't know your name in the upper left corner, but anyway, welcome. Good to see you guys. So tonight, I am going to talk about Fascicle 93 in the Shobogenzo, which is translated as the treasury of the true Dharma I. And the title of the fascicle is Birth and Death. And when we decided earlier in the year to give a series of talks on Dogen's writings, I thought to myself, you know, what do I know about Dogen? Maybe I won't even volunteer for a talk. As Hana mentioned, I had the same experience when I first started reading Dogen. I found it so confusing that I very quickly switched over to reading more contemporary Buddhist writers. And there are a number of people in the Sangha who have put a lot of time and energy into studying Dogen. I know Tim has, and Desiree took a class, and Chris has a weekly Dogen study group, and I haven't done any of those things. So I thought, you know, maybe I shouldn't even be doing this. But then a couple years after I started practice, I tried Dogen again, and I was still confused quite a bit of the time. Maybe there was just a little bit of understanding now and then. But the interesting thing was I felt like I was doing something good, even though I was still most of the time confused. And that was a big change. So in that spirit, I decided I'll give a talk on Dogen. Now I started keeping a Zen notebook several years ago, and in that notebook I would write down things that I've read, or things that I heard in a Dharma talk, or maybe in a conversation with a teacher, a little something that really hit me at the time that I read it or heard it. And it's been really motivating for me that notebook's gotten kind of big over the years, but it's been really motivating for me to read through it from time to time to really keep me practicing. And I think what I've been doing in that notebook is writing down examples of what does Zen practice look like in day-to-day life. That's the thing that I think for me is really important. So one of the little quotes I have is from Pema Chodron, who's in her 80s now. It's been a Tibetan tradition practitioner for probably 60 years. And someone asked her, what would you say is the essence of Buddhist practice? And she said, be kind to yourself and to others, and if there's a problem, try to make it better. And then I have a couple from Suzuki Roshi, and one of them is, accept what is as it is and help it to become its best. And another one is, make your best effort at each moment forever. So I was thinking about what if I give a talk on Dogen, what am I possibly going to talk about? And I remembered that I have a quote from Dogen in my little notebook, and it's from this fascicle, Birth and Death. So, obvious choice. And to me, it seems like it's very much about day-to-day life, which I don't know that you often get that feeling when you read Dogen. So this is a very short fascicle. It's only a page and a half. I'm going to read you the whole thing, which won't take very long, and then we'll talk about it. So, birth and death. As a Buddha is in birth and death, there is no birth and death. It is also said, as a Buddha is not in birth and death, a Buddha is not deluded by birth and death. These statements are the essence of the words of the two Zen masters, Cha-shan and Ding-shan. Never neglect them, as they are the words of those who attain the way. Those who want to become free from birth and death should understand the meaning of these words. If you search for a Buddha outside of birth and death, it will be like trying to go to the southern country of Yue with your spear heading toward the north, or like trying to see the Big Dipper while you're facing south. You will cause yourself to remain all the more in birth and death and miss the way of emancipation. Just understand that birth and death is itself nirvana. There is nothing such as birth and death to be avoided. There is nothing such as nirvana to be sought. Only when you realize this are you free from birth and death. It's a mistake to suppose that birth turns into death. Birth is a phase that is an entire period in itself with its own past and future. For this reason, in Buddha Dharma, birth is understood as beyond birth. Death is a phase that is an entire period in itself with its own past and future. For this reason, death is understood as beyond death. In birth, there is nothing but birth, and in death, there is nothing but death. Accordingly, when birth comes, face and actualize birth, and when death comes, face and actualize death. Do not avoid them or desire them. This birth and death is the life of a Buddha. If you try to exclude it, you will lose the life of a Buddha. If you cling to it, trying to remain in it, you will also lose the life of a Buddha. And what remains will be the mere form of a Buddha. Only when you don't avoid birth and death or long for it do you enter a Buddha's mind. However, do not analyze or speak about it. Just set aside your body and mind, forget about them, and throw them into the house of the Buddha. Then all is done by the Buddha. When you follow this, you are free from birth and death and become a Buddha without effort or scheme. Who then remains in the mind? And now here's the paragraph I put in my little notebook, the last paragraph. There's a simple way to become a Buddha. When you refrain from unwholesome actions, are not attached to birth and death, and are compassionate toward all sentient beings, respectful to seniors and kind to juniors, not excluding or desiring anything, with no thoughts or worries, you will be called a Buddha. Seek nothing else. So I'm not going to go through that line by line and try to explain it, but I did want to talk about a couple of the themes that seem very strong to me. The first thing in this piece is the repeated emphasis on do not seek anything different and do not cling to anything. 5 times in just a page and a half, Dogen says things like, face and actualize birth, face and actualize death, do not avoid them or desire them, do not exclude or desire anything, don't avoid birth and death or long for it. Face whatever arises, experience it, and let it move on when it's time to move on. I think Suzuki Roshi is saying exactly the same thing in the 2 quotes I gave earlier. Accept what is as it is and help it to become its best and make your best effort at each moment forever. I think it's exactly the same thing that Dogen's talking about. And it seems to me that you could substitute any moment of our life for the terms birth and death. Things are always arising and passing away, whether it's a breath or a moment or a day or a whole life or a career or a phone call or a vacation. Probably a good idea to practice Dogen's advice to experience things without avoiding or clinging. Maybe years of practicing turning towards each moment of our life, whether it's pleasant or whether it's painful and difficult, and then letting it go and being open to the next moment. Maybe doing that as much as we can over our life will prepare us for the finish line, that we're all going to cross one of these days. The other theme that I noticed in this piece of writing is that the extraordinary, enlightened activity, nirvana, whatever you want to call it, is right here in the midst of our normal, everyday, day-to-day life. It's no place else. Birth and death is just day-to-day life, whatever it may be at any time. Dogen says if you search for a Buddha outside of ordinary life, you won't find one. The first line says, as a Buddha is in birth and death, there is no birth and death. And I would say that that means a Buddha has the same life we have. We're in birth and death. A Buddha is in birth and death. But they see things differently. They don't see birth and death the same way we do. They're not afraid of it. They don't cling to life. They don't try to avoid things. A Buddha who is not deluded by birth and death does not experience birth and death the way most of us do. Dogen says, if you search for a Buddha outside of birth and death, which again, I think is just normal day-to-day life, you're going in the wrong direction and you will miss the way of emancipation. He also says birth and death is itself nirvana. And I think that's true if you don't resist or cling. Not easy, but that's maybe what we're all working on. Birth and death is the life of a Buddha. If you try to exclude it or cling to it, you lose the life of a Buddha. Only if you don't avoid birth and death or long for it can you enter a Buddha's mind. So the only place that's possible is within our ordinary lives. And Dogen also recommends that we not analyze or speak about birth and death, just set it aside. In a talk on this fascicle, Norman Fisher said, we, human beings, are not made to understand life and death, but we can learn how to live in it. So, we're not going to be able to figure it out by talking about it and analyzing it. So as I was writing this talk and reading about it, I noticed that I was having a lot of thoughts and feelings and memories of my father. And I think about him a lot. He was a really good guy. But when I was doing this work, it was coming up quite a bit. And I thought, I wonder what that's about. And I realized that the way he lived his life and the way he died was a very good example of the last paragraph of this fascicle that Buddha in the birth and death fascicle. So to finish this talk, I thought I would just tell you a little bit about his life and death. So my father was born in New York City in 1912, and he was one of 6 kids. He was raised Catholic and attended Catholic schools. And he told me that that schools were really rough. He was left-handed, but they made him right-handed. They wouldn't let him write left-handed. He and probably a lot of other people there was a lot of physical discipline. He got hit with rulers and slapped by priests and nuns. And once when I was in my 40s, we were talking about religion, and he said, he just couldn't, he thought it was an advantage for someone to have a religious practice, but he just couldn't do it. And I asked him why, and he said, I just think I got it beaten out of me in the Catholic schools. So when I was a kid, we went to church twice a year, Christmas Eve and Easter, and for me it was just kind of boring, and I really didn't have any religious training or upbringing at all. when he was 12, his father was killed in an accident, and about a year later, his mother remarried, and the whole family moved from New York City to Alabama. And he went to high school in Birmingham and lived there until he was 19. And he was a very good athlete, so he got a scholarship to play football at Louisiana Tech. I bet none of you have heard of Louisiana Tech in Ruston, Louisiana. He never could have gone to college if it wasn't for that scholarship, because their family was quite poor. And he stayed in Louisiana, graduated from college in 1938, and then went back to New York City. Now, my dad and I had a really good relationship most of the time, especially once I was out of my teens. And he died in 2002 at the age of 90. And at that time, I thought he and I had said everything we needed to say to each other. There was nothing left unsaid, which is a really good feeling to have at the end of a parent's life. But a little while after, a couple years after he died, I realized, there were a couple things I really wished I had asked him about. I was so naive. There was just some things I never thought to talk to him about. He was a very kind, friendly guy. He was friendly and kind to just about everybody. It didn't matter age, children, adults, men, women, any race. He was just a friendly person. And I remember driving with him. He would never get angry. If we were in a traffic jam, he just stayed calm. If, some driver did something, I don't remember him ever laying on the horn or yelling at another driver. I don't know about you, but I think my worst impulses, my worst thoughts and feelings about people come up when I'm driving. I learned a long time ago, don't say anything, just take a few breaths, let it go. But some pretty nasty stuff, But I don't think my dad experienced that. He just was he had a lot of equanimity. And as Dogen says, he was compassionate toward all sentient beings, respectful to seniors, kind to juniors. And the thing I wished I had asked him is, he must have seen a lot of racism in Alabama and Louisiana in the 1920s and 1930s, but it never entered his language or his thinking or how he treated people. I was, kind of unaware of racism growing up, I think. But when I was in the Navy in my early 20s, I was stationed with a lot of people who were, used racist language and thought that way, and it was quite shocking to me. And I realized, I could be like that too if my parents taught me that, but they didn't. So I really appreciated that he was that way. I wish I'd asked him how he was able to see whatever he saw and keep it out of his life and out of his personality. Now, he died from congestive heart failure and dementia. And he had always been a really vigorous, active, physical guy. We did lots of sports things and hiking and things like that as a family. But between 85 and 90, he really declined. He was in a walker. He was very frail. His memory was really quite bad. Near the end of his life, I was sitting talking with him. We were side by side. I think our knees were touching, and we were talking. And he turned away from me to ask my mother a question, and she answered him. And then he said, "Where's John?" So in 10 seconds, he forgot that, we had been talking. But amazingly, through all of that, he was content most of the time. He rarely complained. He was happy to see people. And I remember thinking, how can you stand to be the way? How he's lost almost everything. He's in a walker. He couldn't do much of anything. How could you stand that? How could you be content? I didn't ask him, but I just thought, to me, it seemed like terrible to be in that condition. But he was happy to see people and cheerful, and I don't know how he did it. right near the end of his life, the last thing he said to me was, "It's okay to die if you've had a good life." So he didn't seem to be clinging to life, and he didn't seem to be afraid of death. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, wow, I'd like to be like that when my time comes. So I think he did a really good job of following Dogen's advice in this last paragraph, and I wanted to tell you about him. Sometimes when I'm writing a talk or studying something, material sort of crosses my path from an unusual source. And about 3 weeks ago, I was looking on Facebook, and somebody, I don't even know who, put a poem up there that seemed like a good one to read when we're talking about life and death. And this is a poem by a poet named Uli K. And I could not find out anything about her, but I'll just read you the poem. It's called Particles of You. My mouth still cracks a tender smile whenever people talk about you, and I hope that no one ever feels they need to whisper your name under their breath, as though you are now some kind of glimmer from the past. You are still very much alive in me. Every particle of me holds particles of you. My being lives to carry your presence everywhere I go. And you are certainly alive in too many ways to ever be left unspoken. So, did you say read it again? Sure. Okay. Particles of You by Uli K. My mouth still cracks a tender smile whenever people talk about you. And I hope that no one ever feels they need to whisper your name under their breath, as though you are now some kind of glimmer from the past. You are still very much alive in me. Every particle of me holds particles of you. My being lives to carry your presence everywhere I go. And you are certainly alive in too many ways to ever be left unspoken. So that's what I got to say about birth and death and Dogen's writings. And thank you very much for your attention.